Hello and welcome to the Get Lit Festival. I'm Kate Peterson, Director of Get Lit Programs, a nonprofit housed within Eastern Washington University. Get Lit is a week-long celebration of literature traditionally held in Spokane, Washington. To learn more about Get Lit, to find this year's schedule of events, or to donate, please click on the link below to visit our website, getlitfestival.org. Before I hand it off to Claire Walla, Get Lit's Assistant Coordinator, I want to take a minute to thank our sponsor for this event, the Spokane chapter of the Japanese American Citizens League. The Japanese American Citizens League, the JACL, is a national organization founded in 1929 and is the oldest and largest Asian American civil rights organization in the United States. It is an organization whose ongoing mission is to secure and maintain the civil rights of Japanese Americans and all others who are victimized by injustice and bigotry. The leaders and members of the JACL also work to promote cultural, educational, and social values and preserve the heritage and legacy of the Japanese American community. Thank you so much to the Spokane chapter of the JACL for their generous sponsorship of this event, and also for introducing us to the beautiful work of Kiku Hughes, one of the festival authors who we are celebrating today. Now, Claire Walla will be helping us to get the event started.
Thanks, Kate, and thank you again to the JACL for making this event possible. Today, we're joined by graphic novelist Kiku Hughes and poet John Streamus, both of whom will read from their work, then discuss themes in their writing that represents the Japanese American experience. Our first reader is John Streamus, an associate professor of comparative ethnic studies and American studies at Washington State University, who specializes in the narrative and racial politics of time and space, as well as the Japanese American experience during World War II. He's been published in Times News, The Comparatist, and the Journal of Academic Freedom, among others. Welcome, John.
Thank you. I want to start by reading something that I wrote. I'm going to read in a minute two short poems by my old friend Toyo Suemoto, but I will start with something that I wrote. This was published just 3 months ago in the online literary journal, Rigorous, and it's one long sentence, but it goes fairly quickly. It's called Saw Something, Said Something. I know, of course, he is young and white, professional looking, smart and snappy, confident but not arrogant, successful but not elite. And yet there was something sinister about that messenger bag he carried, something in its calfskin leather, its generous pockets, its zippered pouches, its adjustable shoulder strap, and its small outer flap pockets for passports and boarding passes, something in the way he casually slung it over his left shoulder, something so normal that it looked too normal, too good, too perfect, too white and male and upwardly mobile, too promising and yet too accomplished. And so I had to speak up, to say something, because no one that normal is normal, because he must surely break the standard he keeps so perfectly, because after all, normal is dangerous, mainstream is suspicious, standard is toxic, because the law is unlawful, and because finally, to see nothing is to see something, to see everything. And I saw it, and I said it, and none of us is safe. And from that, I would like to read a couple of short pieces by my old friend Toyo Suemoto. Toyo was imprisoned in the Topaz camp in Utah during the years of the war. She resettled afterward in Columbus, Ohio. She was a poet from long before the war and published in San Francisco and Sacramento area community publications, and then during the war wrote poems about the experience of being in the camps. This is a poem that she wrote. It's a sonnet that she wrote upon arriving, about her arrival in the camp. It's called Barracks Home. This is our barracks, squatting on the ground, tar-papered shack, partitioned into rooms by sheetrock walls, transmitting every sound of neighbors' gossip or the sweep of brooms. The open door welcomes the refugees, and now at last there is no need to roam afar. Here, space enlarges memories beyond the bounds of camp and this new home. The floor is carpeted with dust, wind-borne, dry alkali patterned by insect feet. What peace can such a place as this impart? We can but sense, bewildered and forlorn, that time disrupted by the war from neat routines must now adjust within the heart. And I want to read one more poem that she wrote about her experience. This is, many of her poems did get published individually well, many of them that she wrote while in camp were published in the camp magazine, but I don't think this did appear there. And in fact, I didn't know this until after she died in 2003. This is a small poem called Stand Back Space, and this overlaps with a lot of my interests in the politics of time and space. This is also, of course, about being in the camps. Stand back, space. I must lean against your stars, be done with men's strange words and alien stares. Sky, grant me room enough for me to breathe. I must reach farther than time to catch my breath. Thank you.
Thank you so much, John, for sharing your work and sharing that work with us today. That was great. So our next reader is Kiku Hughes. Kiku Hughes is a cartoonist and illustrator based in the Seattle area. Her work has been featured in the Beyond Anthology Volumes 1 and 2 and the graphic novel anthology Team Avatar Tales, as well as the 6th iteration of the curated comic collection Short Box. Displacement, which was published by First Second in 2020, is her first graphic novel. Please welcome Kiku.
Hi, thanks so much for having me, and thank you, John, for those beautiful poems that were very moving. It was great to hear. So just a quick, context before I start sharing a section from Displacement. Displacement is a story about a fictionalized version of myself being pulled back in time to experience the incarceration camps alongside my grandmother, who was also imprisoned at Topaz in Utah. So the section I'll be reading from is actually my character first arriving at Tanforan, which was the assembly center that was used to displace Japanese Americans before the permanent camps in Topaz. So Tanforan was built in a horse racing track, essentially, and it's now a mall. So I will just share my screen. So yeah, here's the cover, and then how many in your family? Just me. And how old are you? 16. No single rooms, I'm afraid. I'm putting you in a double with another young woman. Barrack 14, Unit 9 at the north end. Thank you. I kept waiting for the dust to come again and take me home. It didn't come. But then I saw her again, my grandmother. She was older than the first time I'd seen her, but somehow I recognized her. She wore the same beret. I listened to her speaking to her parents, my great-grandparents, in Japanese as they moved into the stall next to mine. I could hear them through the thin walls. I couldn't understand them, but I could tell by their tone that they were stressed. I knew no Japanese, and neither did my mom, but Ernestina spoke it fluently. I wondered for the first time why she never passed it on to her children. Hello? Hi? It looks like we're stallmates. Glad at least they had the decency not to stick us in with the male bachelors. I'm Aiko Mifune, Kiku Hughes. This place is disgusting, but we can't just sit around feeling sorry. We'd better get those tick bags filled up so we'll have something to sleep on tonight. Wait, how old are you, kid? I'm 16, and you're alone. Yeah, because, well, I'm alone too, so we'll watch each other's backs in here. Sound okay? Yeah, okay. Good, now let's get going. The sooner we get that horse closet cleaned up, the sooner we can start feeling human again. Aiko helped me survive those early days at camp and uncertainty, the endless waiting in lines. She was Nisei, like my grandmother, but she was so different from everything I knew about Ernestina. She was rebellious and vocal about her opposition to incarceration. I had grown up thinking that nobody resisted the camps, that the Nikkei cooperated quietly, but Aiko was never quiet. We can nail up a sheet for a room divider to give us some privacy, yelling in Japanese, or at least the illusion of privacy. Yeesh. What did they say? You don't want to know. Knock, knock. Yes? Unit 9, I'm Ben Nakamura, your block manager. Per Army orders, I'll be doing roll call each evening at 6:45 and then another at breakfast. There are supposed to be 2 of you here. There are. I'm here. So you're done here. Yes, well, good night, ladies. Slam. Stooge. Good night, Kiku. Night. That night, all I could do was hope that when I woke up, I'd be back on a warm lawn in Seattle. I could barely sleep. The mess hall didn't have enough food for so many people, and between the hunger pangs and the sounds of crying children, it was difficult for any of us to find rest.
Thank you so much, Kiku, for sharing your work and your illustrations. So it's beautiful to see the words accompanied by images. And the conversation between the work that both of you shared is so interesting. I'm eager to hear you discuss it. So I'll hand it over to John now.
Okay, I have a couple of questions that I'd like to ask Kiku. First of all, late in the book, when the character Kiku is talking with her mother about these trips back in time to the 1940s, to the war, to the barracks. In the discussion, we learned that maybe these were not trips necessarily back in time and space, but back instead in memory. And that's, I think, a really, really important
That's
and
right.
very interesting thing. And I wonder if you'd say something about that difference between time and space on the one hand and memory on the other.
Yeah, one of the main reasons I wanted to create that sort of differentiation between time travel and this memory travel is because my grandmother died before I was born, and there were a lot of stories that I'll never get to know because of that. There were parts of her life that were never shared, and so I felt like time travel had an assumption of pure fact. Whereas memory travel to me represented more the emotional impact. So rather than, the nuts and bolts of what happened in the past, sort of the lingering feelings that are passed down, and that sort of being a different kind of truth, I guess.
Yeah. There's been a number of works by Japanese American artists and scholars that link our connection, decades later to the camps more in terms of memory than even in terms of history. And for me personally, I don't have any direct links to the camps. I immigrated to the United States in the 1950s, and my mother was in Tokyo during the war. So I don't have any personal direct links to the camps. And yet, as soon as I started hearing these narratives of the camps and what happened in World War II, and then started meeting some of the people who'd been incarcerated, such as my friend Toyo, I began to feel that it was somehow that I still somehow had a part in that memory. And it's how I became so interested in this story. And even in Ohio, growing up in Ohio, a number of Japanese Americans after the war were relocated to the Midwest, of course. Many of them moved back to the West Coast, but many stayed, including my friend Toyo. And it was amazing to me how many people in places like Cincinnati and Dayton and Columbus, how many Japanese Americans who'd experienced the camps that I'd met there. But Seattle has, of course, a really rich connection to all of this history. And being in Seattle, you must be surrounded by that connection.
You know, it's interesting because I'm in Seattle, but my grandmother was from San Francisco, of course, and moved to New York after the war. And so my mom was the one who moved to Seattle, back to the West Coast, the first generation to move back to the West Coast after everyone was forcibly removed. But because of that whole, generation gap, I didn't grow up, in anywhere near the main cultural centers of Japanese Americans in Seattle. And so I never really felt that connection, and my education on the campus and on that community was really limited. And I realize now, having done all the research for displacement, what a purposeful move that was on the part of the government to split up these, historic Japantowns, these historic communities, and really scatter them across the country. So, in their reasoning at the time, both to negate any threat of spy activity, but realistically, it was more to negate any economic threat to the white farmers on the West Coast. But the lasting impact of that is to really dissolve the sort of cultural centers of Japanese American history in the US. So it is a weird place to be growing up in Seattle, where that is a historically, there's a big Japanese American population, and there are still a lot of people in that community who are, from there since their ancestors first immigrated. But I'm close to that, but not directly connected in that way. So it's
Yeah. And can I assume that since your representation in your graphic novel wasn't taught Japanese, that you yourself don't know Japanese? Because I don't. My mother never taught me.
Yeah, no, I tried to take it in high school, but it did not stick. And my mom also doesn't.
And as an undergraduate, I took 2 years of Japanese, and I don't remember any of it.
Yeah. So there's, again, that sort of, I think, ties into our conversation about memory and versus, the pure facts of history, that I think the sort of language barrier is so strong in a lot of Japanese American communities now too, because the language was not passed down for, for survival reasons in a lot of ways. That there's so many parts of, history that you can't access because it's all in Japanese.
Yeah, when I was researching my dissertation, I went to the San Francisco State University labor archives, because I thought I might want to look at some of the labor activism of Japanese Americans before the war. And the woman who worked there brought out this huge box full of old newspapers and flyers and pamphlets. And she told me, I hope you don't mind that most of these are not in English. And I said, I can't read them if they're not in English. But she said, for anyone who really wants to understand this history, you're going to have to read them in the languages the immigrants brought over with them. A lot of it was Chinese labor activism too. Since then, there was a book that came out, I think in 2006 or 7, by a woman named Josephine Fowler that does work with a lot of that material. But I'm guessing that there's still a lot of Japanese language material from the 20s and 30s that has not been studied, partly because people in the subsequent generations were just not taught that. And that's one of the disruptions in the memory that makes memory a lot more complicated for us, I think, that language gap. Because I know few Japanese Americans born, let's say, anytime after, well, from about the time I was born in the 50s till anytime after that, who really do know Japanese. And it is a barrier in the memory.
Exactly, yeah. Which is why I think memory is so powerful in terms of conveying emotion rather than, I guess, words. That, even through the language barrier, I think, like my mom's generation, were able to at least pick up some of the emotion without necessarily knowing the words.
Yeah. A real simple question. I mean, aside from the fact that this is what you do, why a graphic novel?
You know, definitely it's because it's what I do, but I realized early on as I was researching, especially Topaz, Mina Ukubo is a very well-known Japanese American author who documented her experience in Topaz and Tanforan, the exact same camps that my grandmother was in. As she did an illustrated diary called Citizen 9. Oh, now I'm forgetting.
Citizen 13660.
13660. Thank you.
Yeah.
I always forget the number, which was the number she was assigned by the government when she was taken to the camps. So yeah, she was a young woman at the time, and she created an illustrated diary that was then published. One of the first books published post-war of the Japanese American experience. And so it was essentially a graphic novel, and finding that resource, which was hugely helpful, was really inspiring because it really showed me that sort of the graphic storytelling, the visual storytelling is such a huge part of this history already, that it laid the foundation in many ways for this history, combining words and images in that way. And especially because cameras were not allowed in the camps at first, Mina's illustrations, were a lot of times some of the only access that we have now to, the real material environment that they were living in, because a lot of the photos that were available were taken by the government, were highly sanitized. So yeah.
I'm really struck by it. You showed some of these as you were reading, and some of the panels that you were reading, the shadows, the long shadows in the barracks room. Those give a really great sense of how desolate the place was, and how isolated. Yeah. I noticed too that you reference in your acknowledgments Octavia Butler. And the book of Butlers that yours reminds me of, and I've assigned this in a number of my classes, is Kindred. Tell us about that.
Yeah, so Octavia Butler is definitely one of my inspirations, and Kindred is absolutely what gave me the inspiration for Displacement. For anyone who isn't familiar with her work, Octavia Butler was a Black author living actually in Seattle in the, I believe she died in the early 90s. She was a science fiction author. Yeah. Yeah, she was a science fiction author, and Kindred is a book about a Black American woman who is living in, I believe, the 70s and is pulled back in time against her will to antebellum South, the plantation that her great grandmother was living on. And it is a very complicated book, much more complicated than mine, about the sort of ways that she survives in this situation, and the things that she discovers about the sacrifices that her ancestors made, and who her ancestors were. It's an incredible book, and it's very, her work really showed me early on the ways that sci-fi can be, like sci-fi tropes specifically, can be used to really demonstrate these powerful emotions, and the ways that a lot of, I guess, the sort of sci-fi canon has kind of ignored, marginalized creators that are really doing the groundbreaking work in with these sci-fi tropes. And I've always been a fan of sci-fi, so finding Octavia Butler's work was huge for me.
Yeah, it's also very teachable. Her book is. It's a really wonderful book. Yeah, well, speaking about history, this we're doing this on the 10th anniversary of the meltdown and the tsunami in Japan on 3/11 of 2011. And I noticed that on, I think I wrote down the page number. Yes, the end of page 253 in your book, you have, I forget which characters it is, talking about the cancer rates being unexpectedly high around Topaz. And then one character notes that that Topaz was located in the Southwest, not far from where nuclear testing took place. And that too that was really unexpected to see that. I was glad you put that in there. Of course, Japanese people and Japanese Americans have a special history with the bad side of nuclear power, and there's been a lot of really good scholarship, I know, on that bad side, and I'm trying to add to that myself, to that scholarship. But that location, the remoteness of the location of Topaz, and I was there once. I visited there in 2002, and it really is. It looks as though in the photograph on the back of your book, there's a photograph of, is that your mother that's standing with you?
Yeah.
In front of the Topaz Museum. The museum wasn't there when I visited, and I'm glad.
It's fairly new.
Yeah. Yeah, and the remoteness of the place is a part of the reason it existed at all. But then the remoteness of the testing of facilities for the Manhattan Project also explains them. And of course, we have here in Washington State, Hanford. I've noticed that in the last few years, there have been a number of young or youngish white women novelists who've written books about the Manhattan Project, and they've been very curious. And of course, they're writing about young women, white women, who take jobs in the Manhattan Project, either at Los Alamos or at Hanford or at the Oak Ridge facility. And of course, these young white women characters are the main characters in these books, but being employed in low-level jobs at these facilities, they don't really know what it is because the top secrecy of the mission. They don't know what it is they're working on. So there's a little disconnect there. How can these characters be the protagonists of their novels if they don't know what the real conflict is? There is one book, and that is, in fact, I think she's going to be at Get Lit this year. Sharma Shields' book called The Cassandra. The main character there she doesn't know that she's working on building the atomic bomb, but she senses that there's something like that, and that sense of hers is a part of what makes that novel really. That is the one exception in this slew of novels. And teaching right now a book called Trinity Sight, written by an indigenous Latinx woman, which is also about Los Alamos, but it is very different. It's sort of science fiction, and a lot of strange things happen in it, and it becomes by the end a novel as much about race as about nuclear power, and it's a very, very interesting book. But it does strike me, and I think this. Your mention of Topaz's location in the Southwest puts me in mind of this. So many writers of color and artists of color have, I think, dealt most persuasively with nuclear politics, nuclear culture, and the whole idea of apocalypse or post-apocalypse. And it seems to me that a story from even if it seems the past, such as what happened to Japanese Americans in the war, it can serve as a sort of warning for apocalypse narratives of the future. And I think this is one of the reasons that science fiction and fantasy writers of color have a really important voice in warning us about these things.
Yeah, I agree. And I think, I don't know specifically who I'm quoting right now, but I've definitely heard this concept that apocalyptic narratives written by white authors are just a manifestation of white fears that something that they're doing to other people will happen to them. Which is a clumsy requoting of somebody who said it much better, I'm sure, but yeah, and sort of related to the discussion about nuclear anxieties and the ways in which Japanese Americans specifically relate to those sorts of anxieties. One thing that I wish that I had access to, but I don't know if I ever will. My great grandmother's family was from Hiroshima, and it strikes me that finding out about the bombing when you are either in camp or just out of camp and still in a pretty vulnerable position. I can't even imagine having to sort of shield your emotions because everybody's celebrating around you, and for a fact that your entire family is gone. That is one thing that I haven't seen a lot of scholarship on, but I am very interested in that sort of that struggle.
Yeah, there was one of the camps, and I always forget which one it was. I don't think it was Topaz, but one of the camps concentrated a number of Japanese Americans whose families had come from the two bombed cities, and obviously when they heard about the bombs, I mean, what can you think if you don't know how to trust the news that you're hearing? One of the stories that doesn't get publicized very often about Japanese Americans is that a number of Japanese Americans who were among those labor organizers that from the pre-war years, such as Carl Yoneda and his wife, after the war, because I think some of Carl Yoneda's family were in, I forget which of the bombed cities, but were in one of the targeted cities. They became very active in the anti-nuclear movement after World War II, very, very active for the rest of their lives, in fact. And a number of Japanese Americans after World War II were active in anti-nuclear politics and activism. It doesn't get written about very often, and I've seen the only extensive work on that I've seen is in work on Carl Yoneda himself. But I think that is an important part of the Japanese American story that I think needs more attention. I was going to ask you also about what there is under the narrative that runs through your book. There seems to be also a gender politics, and what can you say about that?
I think it was almost unintentional, but the way that these memories have been passed down to me is exclusively matrilineally through my mother's side and her mother and her mother, because my great grandfather didn't speak a lot of English and didn't communicate with his grandkids that often because of that, because there was that language barrier. So a lot of the history, in my case specifically, was told almost entirely through women's perspectives. I do think there is it was a little bit hard to know how much to address there, because there are certain issues that, again, there's not a lot of scholarship on, and that I wasn't sure that I would be able to handle effectively in terms of being a single woman in this camp situation. But that is, again, something that I wish that I knew more about, because I think, and again, I think those are stories that are probably lost to history because of the nature of, people not wanting to discuss things like sexual assault, people not wanting to, not having any authority to go to in that case, especially if the authority is the one who is the offender. So these are things that, definitely I wish that I knew more about. But in terms of how it sort of played out in my case, it was just the fact that all these stories were held onto by women, and I think that is a common theme in a lot of diaspora communities, that women become these sort of storyteller, the ones who are bearing, I guess, the responsibility of passing on these stories in a lot of ways.
And of course, it's no accident then that whenever there's any doubt cast upon the validity of the narratives, it's usually women's narratives that have that doubt cast upon them. And I don't think that's an accident.
Yeah.
I hadn't even thought about any of the gender politics until I realized in the passage that you showed us, the guy who's the who's apparently the snitch on the Japanese Americans. It occurred to me when I saw that that all of the stories that I've read in the histories and in even in the fictions, the snitches are always men. And it didn't occur to me until I saw that in your book. The snitches are always men. I don't know if that was really true in history, but it's
Yeah, I
certainly
didn't mean to imply,
yeah.
but I do think there's a certain level of, when the authorities are likely only taking men seriously at that time, especially, that there's already that sort of gender bias existing within the authority structure. So I think even if a woman wanted to be a snitch, she probably wouldn't be asked to.
Yeah, probably not. Yeah, yeah. It's interesting, and I've never read anything about this either, but the division of labor within the camps, once the Japanese Americans were settled into the camps, the division of labor seemed awfully gendered. My friend Toyo, I think she always, even though she had a little infant son to care for, she always worked in Topaz. She worked in the library for a while. She taught for a while too. But those were the women's jobs in the camp, and even and this was, her parents didn't really take jobs in the camps, but even so, even the leisure activities they got themselves involved in were also pretty much gendered. And I haven't seen too much about that on writings in the camps.
Yeah, it's funny. One of the few things I know about my great grandfather is he did try to work in the camps as both a gardener, farmer, and a carpenter, and apparently was not good at either one. But but yeah, those were sort of men's jobs, so that's what he was gonna do.
Yeah. Yeah. Let's see. I wanted to ask also about because I think this is a really important part of your book, what you're writing about in the last few pages, linking up what happened in the 1940s to what's happening today. And of course, there's quite a few Japanese American activists who are active in immigration politics today. So could you say something about that?
Yeah, I wrote this book pretty much from the start of the Trump administration to, I was finishing it up as the election was starting last year. And so it's set in that time because that's sort of where my brain was at the time, and where it was, the 2016 election was a big factor in motivating a lot of Japanese Americans to get more involved in issues with immigration, with migrant detention. That was sort of a big moment. So I do feel like it was part of Japanese American history in that way. But of course, now as I'm older and sort of having read more, I definitely understand, and I wish that I had included in the book, but of course it's too late now, that these policies that were in place during the last 4 years were not isolated events, that this sort of migrant detention was happening in the Obama administration as well, and continues to happen in the Biden administration. And even though I do think it was a big instigator to getting a lot of Japanese Americans talking about camp again, I think it's also our responsibility to make sure it's not tied to, the previous administration. Make sure that this sort of energy is kept up, even with a Democratic president. Kids are still being separated at the border. There are still these detention centers, which are essentially concentration camps, and that is also part of the fabric of American history. So, yeah, and I think that is a big thing that I'm glad to be seeing a lot in Japanese American circles, in the in the Seattle chapter of the JACL, even they're hosting a lot of workshops, sort of contextualizing the Japanese American experience, camps and otherwise, within the broader scope of the ways in which the United States has inflicted this violence on different communities again and again in ways that, you know, are all slightly different but still building off each other. Yeah.
I think that's one of the nice things about your book is that you create that sort of contextualizing, that sort of conversation between past and present that reinforces the idea of memory over the idea of time and space. I teach ethnic studies, and one of the difficulties, I think one of the drawbacks of teaching ethnic studies is that the way our courses are put together, there's a tendency to just focus on one particular event or one chain of events at a time, and not to contextualize across racial groups or historical periods. And one of the encouraging things that I've seen lately in studies of Japanese Americans in the camps, for example, in fact, my class has just finished reading a book by Naomi Pak called Rightlessness. And the first 2 chapters are concerned with the camps and the redress movement. And then her next sets of chapters cover the various imprisonments in the 1990s and in recent years in the post 9/11 period of imprisonments at Guantanamo. And her whole point is that camps have become the 20th and 21st century way of separating, isolating, and marginalizing people who are defined in some way as enemies of the state or as national security threats. And I think that is a development in the studies of the camps that I think is really helpful, because in the past, I mean, all the great books written about them in the past were, however good they were, they still focused entirely on the camps and didn't put them into conversation with other parts of US history or global history. And a book like Rightlessness does put them in that conversation. And at the end of your book, you create that conversation too.
Thanks. Yeah, I do think that's very important. And I think the activism that was happening in the 70s and the 80s, you know, of my parents' generation, I think it was focused on the camps almost entirely, I think, because there was so much information that was not being given to that generation, that I think, you know, they really did lay a groundwork for, you know, exposing a lot of the things that they were never told about camp. So I think my generation's role now is to put that knowledge seeking that they did in a greater context of American civil rights, and sort of try to make sure that we are not, you know, laser focused on only Japanese American experiences when they are always in conversation with other marginalized groups.
I have one last set of questions that I want to ask you. Do you see yourself doing anything more with the story of the camps? And regardless of the answer to that, what's next for you? What's your next book going to be?
I am not sure about doing anything specifically about the camps anymore. I am working with the Wing Luke Museum on one of their graphic novel series about the camps. So that is actually one more project that I'm doing, but I'm only the illustrator for that. I'm not doing the writing. So, yeah, I think my next projects, I'm really hoping to focus more on the sci-fi aspect. And I always want to do works that, you know, use sci-fi as a device to highlight, you know, the problems of the present. Obviously, that's what sci-fi is for. So I'm hoping to, my next project, I'm hoping to be working more with surveillance and the sort of the Internet of Things and the ways in which that sort of surveillance and the Internet of Things in the modern era are used against marginalized groups in disproportionately, and yet are given to us as a convenience. So that's sort of my next project.
Good. I hope you've been getting good feedback from the Japanese American community about this book. I'll bet
I have, and it's meant so much to me, because again, yeah, growing up feeling kind of separate. I really think the working and studying and learning for this book has helped me really find myself as a Japanese American, and it's been, yeah, very, very honored to have had people read it and enjoy it.
Oh. Yeah, one last thing, and that is there's been in recent months, in fact, it spiked even, I mean, there was a spike, of course, last year when the lockdowns first started because of the pandemic, but there seems in the last 2 or 3 months to have been even a much bigger spike in violence and hateful acts towards Asian Americans. And I know some politicians, even President Biden, have spoken out against that. But I wonder what you have, what your thoughts on that are.
Yeah, I mean, obviously it's distressing and worrying. I don't have a lot of thoughts except for
Yeah.
it's alarming, and it is also, not something that ever really went away. If you think about the case of Vincent Chin in Michigan, these sorts of anti-Asian attacks just sort of come and go, but they've never really gone away entirely. I think obviously the rhetoric around COVID early on was blatantly racist, and that's a huge part of why this is happening now. And yeah, that sort of creating of a scapegoat is one of the things, I tried to allude to early on in Displacement with, the Native Sons of the Golden West were creating this economic anxiety around Japanese American farmers long before World War II. This sort of ramping up of othering of a group because of, and then latching onto one big disaster to say, see, we told you, is sort of, that's the textbook way. So.
And there is a historical continuum. I mean, however different the individual acts of violence or hatred may be, they are still all part of a historical continuum. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
By the way, one last thing. I love the title of your book. I think that's a great word for your book. I would have never thought of a word like that, but it's Displacement is just a great title. So
thank you so much.
Yeah. Well, I'd like to thank the Get Lit program for putting this together. This has been really nice. I've enjoyed this.
Yeah, it's been great. Thank you so much, John, for hosting or for starting these conversations.
Thank you for your book. It's really great.
Thank you.
That was wonderful. Thank you both for being here. Thank you for sharing your work, and thank you for having such an important conversation with us today. That was really wonderful. I would like to thank again the Spokane chapter of the Japanese American Citizens League for sponsoring this event and making it possible today. And to our audience at home, please make sure to visit getlitfestival.org to learn more about these writers, to find other free festival events, including another event with Kiku Hughes on graphic novels that we're really excited about. So make sure to check that out on our festival schedule. And to donate to help support the festival, make sure again to visit getlitfestival.org. Thank you again for joining us, and we will see you at the next event.